Hello and welcome to Oh God, What Now? I'm Jacob Jarvis, enjoying hosting the show until Penny Mordaunt makes me join the army. On today's edition, the Commons returns at full speed with a school concrete crisis making Sunak wish he'd never come back from California. And we've had not one but two reshuffles, with the PM tweaking his top team and Keir Starmer doing the same. Plus, what do young people need? No, it's not as obvious as better homes and job opportunities. According to the AI Conservative idea generator this week, it's national service. We discuss the latest wartime nostalgia headline grabber from the Tories. Before we begin, a quick reminder. Through the miracle of modern technology, as well as listening to us, you can now also watch the show on YouTube. Just go to youtube.com/Oh God What Now, and if you can't remember that, there's a link in the show notes too. Now, let's meet the panel. Ros Taylor needs no introduction, but she's an Oh God What Now mainstay, Bunker podcast regular, freelance editor, and a keen hiker. Hello, Ros. How are you?
Hello, Jav. I think, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak when it comes to the hiking. But thank you, nonetheless. I like to be thought of as such.
Don't underestimate yourself. Ros, Jeremy Hunt has told us to brace for an inflation blip, a little blip. But he's insisted the plan to get it down is still working. Is he just setting himself up for more failure here when it inevitably doesn't work?
Well, it's very hard to say exactly what's going to happen with inflation. The Bank of England says it's going to fall to 5% by December, but the Bank of England has been wrong consistently a lot lately. And there is still a stubborn problem with it not going down as fast as the government wants it to. And basically, Hunt is worried that fuel prices in particular will mean that in September it goes up again after some falls. And then there's other stuff going on as well, which things like wages are going up, which is not going to help inflation either. It's great for people, but it's not going to help inflation. Grain prices are still up due to the Ukraine war and lots of wrangling over what's happening with the Black Sea deal for the Ukrainian wheat. There may be a cold winter, which may well put energy prices up again. So it's really, in many ways, not in his control. And another worrying aspect is that there's some research in the US now that suggests that the interest rate rises there are leading to higher rents, which of course is pushing up inflation because buy-to-let landlords are passing on their extra costs to their tenants. And it may well be that that is happening here too. So there's a lot of factors, and I wouldn't be very confident if I was Jeremy Hunt.
Is Jeremy Hunt being kind of swept up in a sort of boosterish groupthink, do you think, by the Conservatives? I mean, he just seems to me he was meant to come in and be really sensible and deliver hard and horrible news, and then he's slowly come around to being really positive. Are they missing that void of a cheerleader that Boris Johnson has left, and Jeremy Hunt's maybe slightly morphing himself very, not quite all the way, but a little bit into that role?
Well, I mean, he will be aware as much as Sunak is of the pledges that Sunak made for the end of the year. And one of those is inflation. Another, of course, is small boats, another problem which they are very much not on top of, with record numbers landing over the weekend. So he's got to, what else is there to do at this stage of this dying government, really, rather than talk yourself up as much as you can and live in your own happier universe where things are indeed going to get much better before the next election.
Zoë Grünewald is a policy and politics correspondent at the New Statesman. New job title. Congratulations, Zoe.
Thank you.
Also a fluffy cat owner and, most importantly, our friend. Hello, Zoe.
Hello.
So former PM and Home Secretary Theresa May has said in her memoir, which I'm sure nobody can wait to read, that she regrets using the phrase hostile environment. She writes, in retrospect, it was not a good term to use. Is this jarringly late, seeing as so many people, no one else really needed retrospect, did they? So many people at the time told her it wasn't a good phrase to use.
I think for us, yes, but I think a lot of her Conservative colleagues, and specifically her successors in the Home Office, like Suella Braverman, would probably think she hadn't gone far enough there. But yes, Theresa May seems to be having a bit of a reckoning with herself and with her work as both Prime Minister and Home Secretary. And that's what she talks about a lot in her new book, which I haven't read, but I've read lots of reviews of, including one by our political editor at the New Statesman, Andrew Marr. And one of the things he says that she does in this book is she apologises a lot for a lot of things. So she apologises not only for using the term hostile environment when she was in the Home Office, which she says she believes contributed to the Windrush scandal, but also for her believing the smears about Liverpool fans after Hillsborough, and for failing to visit the Grenfell families in the immediate aftermath of the fire, and a few other things as well. And I think it's really interesting because we have seen since May left government, she's sort of softened, and she actually has become one of the most vocal critics of some of the government's immigration policies. So she's one of the most ardent supporters of more protections for victims of modern slavery. And generally, I think she's actually doing herself quite a few favours on the backbenches. She seems to be one of the more compassionate Conservatives. And when you compare her to the current sort of policy direction of the government, she comes across looking very moderate. And I mean, Andrew Marr's review of her book was pretty glowing, to be honest. So maybe we should read it. I don't know.
Should we be cautious about letting her do this kind of rebranding of herself, though? I mean, I just don't personally know, and maybe this is me being a bit bitter and grizzled here, but know whether she really deserves that chance. It's fair enough to say she's sorry, and that's fine and welcomed, but I don't know if it actually really should change our position, particularly looking at her historically as a figure in politics, or going forward. I mean, what do you
No,
think?
I agree. I think, it's great to see a politician looking back, admitting some of their mistakes and apologising. And that's something we've had a real dearth of when you look at Johnson and Truss, for example. So she represents a kind of humility that is missing from, I think, a lot of political leaders. But you're right, she still has a lot of things to answer for, and she's still on the Conservative benches. So, how sorry are you, I guess, is the question. But I mean, I would have to read the book to see fully exactly how much she cops to and what she thinks of it now, and whether she posits any, alternative solutions as well, or whether you're right, she's just trying to, rewrite her reputation a little bit.
You could go to one of her really expensive after-dinner talks at some point, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah, I can definitely afford that.
I understand she gets quite an easy ride, relatively speaking, in Roy Stewart's new book as well, which is quite excoriating, apparently, about almost everyone in the Conservative administration since he joined it. But she gave him, a couple of decent jobs that he did reasonably well in. So she may come better out of that. That is apparently quite an exciting read, though perhaps I shouldn't plug the people who run rival podcasts.
Yeah, don't read either of those books, just listen to our podcast is what I'll say there. The Commons has returned after recess, and Rishi Sunak will be desperately wishing he was back watching Taylor Swift or sipping a mocktail in sunny California. A concrete crisis has seen schools shut across the country, and the Prime Minister has been accused of being too tight to fund repairs back when he was Chancellor. Meanwhile, he's rejigged his top team in a mini reshuffle, a little cabinet tinker, if you will. And Keir Starmer has done the same, but with a bit more gusto. Ros, let's start with the concrete fiasco. It's a little on the nose, isn't it, that schools in England are literally falling apart? But is it in any way a surprise, or is it just, it's quite indicative, it feels to me, of Sunak's particular brand of mismanagement?
Well, it wasn't a surprise to councils who warned about it, and it wasn't a surprise to the National Audit Office who warned about it quite recently. But it does seem to have come as a surprise, nonetheless, to the press and the government. Is it his particular style of mismanagement? Well, it's not so much mismanagement as the entire Conservative approach, because this dates back much further. It goes back to the decision that Michael Gove made in 2010 when the coalition came in to drop the schools rebuilding programme that Labour had begun. Now, that was a decision that was clearly linked to austerity. It was something that could fall by the wayside under the financial pressure that the government said it was under at the time. And it's part of that pattern of cutting corners to save money. I think I'm just super incredibly grateful today that my kids are able to go back this week. And the fact that I'm incredibly grateful that my kids can go back to school this week without them returning to home learning or being shoved in a shipping container or whatever else emergency measure is being made is, as you say, testament to the state this country is in. And I was particularly struck when I was doing a bit of extra research today, looking at a new sports centre that Winchester College, which is Rishi Sunak's alma mater, is building. Major new sports centre, begun during lockdown. It's nearly finished now. The roofs are on. There's new squash and 5 courts, and those squash and 5 courts have underfloor heating. It's cost millions and millions of pounds, and all funded thanks to tax-free donations to the charity that is with Winchester College. So, yeah. I'm angry.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I knew what squash was when I was at school, but I suppose I grew up under Labour governments, and my school was nicknamed Shitty City, and it kind of vaguely did me all right. But there was never any consideration that it was genuinely dangerous to my safety. I mean, maybe there were a few bullies who were a little bit of a danger to my safety, but the physical structure of the school itself
And
was
I
never
I
a
can
risk.
assure you that squash is a very sweaty sport
Yeah.
in which you definitely do not need underfloor heating in order to practice.
So, Education Secretary Gillian Keegan has also looked to kind of dodge blame for everything. And after an interview with ITV, while still mic'd up, which barely I would say is kind of hot mic, it was just mic'd up. She's barely even finished the interview when she said it. She goes, "Does anyone ever say, you know what, you've done a fucking good job because everyone else has sat on their asses and done nothing? No signs of that, no." Which is just, I mean, I think it's really lazy to compare everything to the thick of it, but the thick of it wouldn't do that. The thick of it would have been at least more convoluted, and it would have needed for the drama there to have been a bit of pause where then they went, "Oh fuck, it was hot mic." Whereas this was just so quick turnaround, it was ridiculous. I mean, but on what she was saying, do any of their excuses whatsoever wash? You know, Sunak has spoken of numbers of rebuilds and refurbs, but nothing seems to add up as far as I can see.
I mean, this was an off-mic moment in a league with Gordon Brown and his bigoted woman.
Yeah.
We know what happened after that, and John Major and his bastards over Euroscepticism. And yeah, this one is going to go down in the probably it will be played back many, many, many times.
Every single person asking Rishi Sunak, "Do you think Gillian Keegan is doing a fucking good
Starmer's
job?"
going to have a lot of fun at
Constantly,
PMQs this
yeah.
week, yeah. Do any of their excuses wash? No, I mean, he'll argue that COVID has emptied the coffers and that that's why we haven't been able to repair schools. But as I mentioned earlier, the National Audit Office had warned that this was an urgent problem, and he was told that loads of schools needed to be repaired, and he only actually funded a quarter of the schools that needed repairs. It is a long pattern of underinvestment in buildings because it's an easy thing to let go when you're under financial pressure, or you want to cut taxes, or you're instituting an austerity policy, because people don't notice it happening until the roof starts falling in.
Yeah.
And it's something that just should happen in the background all the time automatically, and there shouldn't even be a question that when a school has this particular kind of dangerous aerated concrete, or when a school has structural problems, that it is immediately repaired. It's a school, not a bloody church, for God's sake. I mean, we have charities that deal with churches that are falling down. This is a public institution where we all send our kids. It is a public responsibility to ensure that they're not a danger. And yet it has been consistently cut back on.
I mean, also just on the political angle of them not seeming to see that if a kid gets injured in one of these schools and then it is determined that it's because the government was being too tight because the roof has fell in on a child. I remember many years ago when I worked for a newspaper being sent out to a school where a roof had fell in on a kid, and it was massive. So many people were focused on it, and from a purely cynical level, away from the fact that obviously that's fucking scary, horrible for the family, horrible for the child. From a political angle, it's like, do you really want to get yourself in the position where you could have maimed children through your just complete negligence to schools? It just seems to me
It's
there's
like
no thought to it.
It's like running down the NHS. People are dying and have died in their tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, because of the NHS's failures. But those people aren't really, if a child died because the roof fell in, you would at least hear about it. People die in the NHS all the time, and you don't hear about it because of what the government has done.
So with this Gillian Keegan comment, does it feel completely like a gaffe to you? Because maybe I'm giving her way too much benefit of the doubt and I'm putting too much thought into it because I'm imagining myself as an MP and thinking how paranoid I would be constantly. Is there any way that it could be contrived in some way? Because it just seems it's so rookie.
Yes, it is really rookie because, as you say, and anyone can watch the clip, it's almost 5 seconds after the interview ends. She's still mic'd up and she's talking directly to the interviewer. You can be cynical about it, and there are two potential things, I think. The first is that she's trying to shift blame onto previous education secretaries and possibly Sunak as well. So when she talks about people sitting on their arse or whatever the comment was, having that caught on on microphone and having it broadcast will get people talking about, well, who does she mean? You know, is she talking about the previous education secretary? Is she talking about the prime minister? Is she talking about the former chancellor? You know, all these questions. And then the other way you can be cynical is that this moves on the news agenda. So on the radio this morning, a former government official basically said in an interview that Sunak had refused this funding that was needed to basically rebuild and mend schools back in 2021. And obviously that puts Sunak very much in the shit, to be frank. Yeah. So it's possible, you could think, if you're being cynical, that she was trying to move the agenda on from that particular comment. But I mean, I think it doesn't reflect well on her what was said. It's not like she's just put something out there that would move the news agenda on. I think really people will listen to that and think, you want us to pat you on the back for doing a good job when ceilings could be crumbling on our children's head. No. And I think if it was deliberate, it would be a bit more nuanced than that. I think what it was, and Ros, we were talking about this earlier, you were saying she's tired, she's probably feeling really annoyed. You know, she's not been education secretary for that long, and there have been multiple education secretaries in the last year alone. And probably, feeling a bit like, why is this all my fault? And I don't think you really can get away with that when you're education secretary. Yeah. I don't think people will have much sympathy for it, but I think she just had a very bad lapse of judgment.
The thing I find strange about that, though, is these people do want these jobs. Whenever I have political arguments with my dad about something, he'll say something like, I couldn't do better. And I think, well, yeah, because you're not in that job. I couldn't do better than a brain surgeon, but they're a fucking brain surgeon. I didn't choose to be a brain surgeon. So that just feels to me, I can imagine it is stressful to be education secretary, hence why I've got no desire to be at this moment in time. Politically, looking at Sunak here, you mentioned it throws him in the shit completely, and Gillian Keegan maybe has been a bit of a meat shield there to some extent. Does it feel like he's hit a low here, though? Can it hurt him that much more? Or is he sort of bottomed out and it feels like there has to be a bottom on how popular he is, or has he not quite got there yet?
It just feels like it gets worse and worse for the Conservatives. And as you were saying before, you know, there's really no more visceral representation than the state that the Conservatives have left the public services in, than ceilings crumbling on children's heads. I mean, it really is the epitome of everything a government shouldn't be doing, the amount of neglect that shouldn't be coming from a government that is supposed to inject funding into these institutions. So, you know, you wonder how it could get worse for Sunak. And unless there was an actual disaster and it happened, then potentially not. But I just think we're going to see this story rumble on and on. We still don't know the full extent of how many schools are affected. There's also evidence that hospitals are affected. Other public buildings have this aerated concrete. So this story is going to rumble on. And when it's finally revealed just how many buildings are in trouble, just how many times the government missed an opportunity to pump money in and to sort this problem out, it's going to get worse and worse for Sunak. And I think he's basically gifted a new attack line to Labour, which is this man would have let ceilings fall on your children's head.
Ros, we're going to talk about reshuffles in a moment, but does this crisis kind of also sum up why there's such an issue with the amount of cabinet movement there has been? Because you say this has been a sort of slow creep of them grinding stuff down. And one part of that is they can shift responsibility onto more and more people behind them. But another thing is they seem to kind of just lose track of jobs they were doing and how that might affect them in the future. Sunak really here maybe has been hamstrung by a decision he himself made while doing another job not very long ago.
Yeah, it's just very difficult when you're constantly changing jobs to actually get on top of your brief and understand it. You know, if somebody in the public sector or in the corporate world changed jobs as often as the cabinet do, it would just be completely unsustainable. And yet they're supposed to just slot into these jobs immediately and be on top of their brief. And that makes it impossible for them to argue for the priorities that their department has, because they haven't got time to work out what those priorities are. In addition, because of the political uncertainty and the kind of mad political world that we've been living in for the last couple of years, they're constantly jostling for preferment. They're constantly got an eye to their personal advancement, where they are in the pecking order, who they're backing next, who's in, who's out. And that's going to take up their time when they should be actually running a department. So the pressure of time and the pressure is just too great for them to be able to do their jobs properly.
Well, going on to people who can't do their jobs properly, let's talk about those changes. So there's that urban legend that goes, in a major city, you're never more than 6 feet away from a rat. And if you're Grant Shapps, you're never more than 5 minutes away from a new ministerial role, it would appear. A senior Tory reportedly said his appointment is like letting a child into the nuclear bunker and encouraging him to play. Are you in equal measure sad to see Wallace go and baffled to see Shapps put into the role of Defence Secretary?
Well, I'm not going to bat for Wallace. I don't think he was half as wonderful as
No.
people seem to have said he was. He was just halfway
I would
competent,
agree.
which is
Yeah.
quite rare in
He's
this government.
more wonderful than
Yeah.
everyone else
Yeah.
at the moment.
I mean, I was not surprised, though, to see Shapps put there because he's a great loyalist and Sunak values that. And looking at what happened to, his predecessors, you can only... you can only looking at what happened to his predecessors, you can understand why. He's a very interesting character, Grant Shapps, not necessarily in a good way, not necessarily a particularly bad way. He's a bit of a wide boy, basically.
Yeah.
And listeners who will remember Minder, it always Grant Shapps makes me think of Minder quite often. He's always got, a business scheme going on before he went into Parliament and was eager to promote it in ways which were interesting. He's not from the kind of elite background that many in the cabinet are. He has a business and finance degree from Manchester Metropolitan University, which is not especially elite. And he has no real ties to the defence establishment, which oddly enough may well be an advantage to him as far as Sunak is concerned, because you're less susceptible to special pleading when you haven't got a background in that area. And there is pressure on the Ministry of Defence at the moment to use its estates to house migrants. And Wallace resisted that pressure. It remains to be seen whether Shapps will resist it. So that could also be very useful.
Yeah, I was reading back on the Michael Green scandal and just really enjoyed the book. Was titled "Get Rich Number Free" with the number spelled out free. I just thought, fucking hell! As someone who cares about copy, I was like, don't use the digit there at the same time.
Yeah.
It was so piss poor in every single way.
I say Minder. He's really more Del Boy, to be honest. Yeah.
Zoe, I kind of lost track a little bit who's in the cabinet after that mega resignation day under Boris Johnson. Now, who else has moved around, and are they any good? Claire Coutinho, for example.
Yes, so
she's worth attention.
So Claire Coutinho replaced Grant Shapps' role as Environment and Energy Sec. So Coutinho's really interesting. So she is a 2019 intake. She's the first of the 2019 intake to enter the cabinet. She's a Sunak loyalist, and she used to be a Treasury spad as well. And what is interesting about Coutinho is that she is also a One Nation Conservative, but she's a Sunak loyalist. And the two don't necessarily not go hand in hand, but it's interesting that she's been put in this role because we've seen Sunak backtrack quite a bit recently on his green policies and a little bit of sparring over energy and environment policies within the Conservative Party post the Uxbridge by-election. Coutinho, when she was elected into government, her maiden speech was all about the environment and renewables, and she described her East Surrey constituency as the lungs of London. But of course, having been a Treasury spad, she's also going to be Treasury minded and she's going to be thinking a lot about money, which is very important to the Conservatives, of course. So this is an interesting role for her because how will she tread that very strange line that Sunak has created of going along with net zero, but being slightly sceptical of green policies, whilst maintaining the economic cost and risks of certain policies? She'll have to do that. So that's a really complicated
It
brief.
seems like a weird job to give to a mate, basically. I'd be quite pissed off if my mate gave me that job, which was essentially putting me in a really annoying tightrope walk.
It's almost as if he's been like, I have a lot of faith in you and you're going to prove yourself in this very difficult role. And people are already saying, could she be the next leader of the Conservative Party? Because she's sort of been propelled quite quickly to this position, a bit like Sunak was. He was very quickly up and coming. So I think she's an interesting person to watch. It will be really interesting to see how she handles that brief. What I find quite ironic is, so she went from Children's Minister into that role, just as all the ceilings, started collapsing on our children's head, almost as if, her walking out the department.
So it's not that bad a job then that she's got. She's moved out of a terrible job into a pretty bad one.
She's probably feeling quite happy about that right now. But obviously, one of the most important things to young people is the environment. And she will be taking a lot of that that interest that she knows from her role as children's minister into this role as environmental sec. So it'd be interesting again to see whether she advocates for future generations, whether she advocates for children, and whether she carries that on. So she's definitely one to watch. Grant Shapps will just carry on being Grant Shapps in defence. And apart from that, it was a pretty lacklustre reshuffle, really.
Well, with that, why hasn't he been bolder? I don't really kind of understand. It's been talked about doing a reshuffle for ages. He's then being kind of forced into it a little bit by Wallace going, why not just do the out-and-out reshuffle now? Much as, because Labour's, we can speak about that in a moment, seems to have been much more heavy-handed and more tangible than this. So why not? Especially if, even closer to election, he's going to do another reshuffle, which just would feel a little bit pointless to me.
So I think, well, he was his hand was forced a little bit by Ben Wallace's resignation. But I think what we're seeing here is a prime minister who is deathly afraid of his party.
His hand is always forced, it seems to me. And I kind of think, well, you are prime minister and politics happens. Surely you're guessing that bad things will happen that you have to deal with.
Also, he's got so many people within his party and outside of it saying, what's your vision, Sunak? What is your vision for the future? Not just for the next year, but for the general election and onwards. What are you offering to the electorate? And this could have been a great opportunity for him to completely shake things up, get a bunch of new thinkers within government, get a bunch of new faces, people that the electorate would get to know and maybe they'd start to like, and, rejuvenate this stale conservatism. But he's so afraid, I think, of provoking more conservative psychodrama. So he's basically just filled in the gaps where he needs to. And I think he's, people might say he's being cautious or he's sticking with what works. And he'll probably argue that there's no point switching things up too much when there's so many serious issues at hand that won't be fixed by just moving people in and out of government. And, you can see that there's an appetite from the public for stability, to have those same faces in. We saw so much churn. Many people might argue that introducing more churn would just create that impression of instability again. Yeah. But I think people are now looking at Sunak and thinking, does this man have any vision? Yeah. And I think the fact that he's refused to do a proper reshuffle when he had the opportunity to is now making people think, well, he's too weak to have a vision. He's just,
It seems like his vision is, if it's broken, don't fix it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Which seems really, really
because you might break it even more.
Yeah, exactly. What about the Labour side then? What were the big surprises there?
So this was a much more assertive reshuffle from Starmer. And what we saw here was something we've been seeing from Starmer consistently for the last 18 months or so, mostly in selections for Labour candidates, but also through, obviously, his purge of Jeremy Corbyn from the Labour Party. So he's very much trying to get his influence and this Blairite influence over the party and purge a little bit more of the soft left. So I think there were two major surprises. The first was the promotion of Angela Rayner. So there was lots of briefing coming out prior to this reshuffle that Rayner might be in trouble. And the reason for this is because Rayner is a big face on the soft left. She's obviously, she was an ally of Corbyn. She worked closely with Corbyn, and now she's in Starmer's government. And there's always been reports that there's been a bit of tension between Starmer and Rayner. But he's kept her in, and not only that, he's now made her his official shadow deputy prime minister, and he's given her the levelling up brief. So that's a big brief. It's very important to Labour. Red Wall connections are very important to them. So he's given her a quite a prominent role. But of course, having given her that, he's got rid of Lisa Nandy, and he sent Lisa Nandy to international development. This has, I think, not necessarily shocked a lot of people, because there were reports that there were some tensions with Lisa Nandy in the cabinet, that some maybe felt she was disloyal. And Lisa Nandy, to all credit to her, she's now gone to this new brief and accepted it, and still wants to work as part of a team.
Is it a new brief that she's not actually shadowing anywhere though as well? It's like there's not a counterpart to her.
I think it represents the new machinery of government changes, but it's international development, so she'll be under David Lammy in obviously his position as Secretary Shadow Foreign Affairs Sec. So it's all a lot of political wrangling, basically, and it's traditional Labour factionalism. And what we've seen here is Starmer really consolidating his influence over the party and the Blairite influence over the party. So you see people reintroduced, like Pat McFadden. He's going to be a campaign coordinator. We've got Liz Kendall back in as well. These are all quite strong Blairite figures. And what I would say as well with Pat McFadden is that he... sorry, one second. What I would say with Pat McFadden is being the campaign coordinator essentially squeezes Rayner a little bit. So he'll be very much in charge of how Labour position themselves running up to the next election. And so he'll be keeping that. He'll be like the deputy prime minister almost, or the deputy shadow leader to Starmer, because he'll have that vision of how Labour should be producing themselves. So it's a very interesting reshuffle. A lot of Blairite influences. The soft left have been squeezed. They've kept Rayner there, probably to keep the soft left happy as well. But we're definitely seeing that consolidation of Starmerism, what Starmer wants going forward to the next election, and that influence from Tony Blair still very much present.
Ros, what do you think Starmer wants from this? Is it about that pushing the Blairite vibes on it, or is it a bit of a constant battle of optics at this point, that he's seen Sunak be timid and shambolic? So he wants to look bold and decisive. So he's thought, fuck it, I'll really shake things up because he won't, and I can show that I can.
I think it's less optics than wanting to get a new shadow cabinet in place well ahead of the next election. I mean, obviously, we don't know exactly when it's going to be. Alex Andreou, who I was talking to on Bunker Start Your Week this morning, thinks it's going to be the spring. I would love to see it in the spring, but I fear it may not be until later in the year. And I think the latest possible data can be is the beginning of 2025, which seems an age away. But what this means is that the whole shadow cabinet has the time to bed in and to really make their mark before the election, whereas the contrast with Sunak is that he's done a mini reshuffle, but he's obviously planning to do another reshuffle again closer to the election. And that means that whoever, for example, might be Home Secretary instead of Suella Braverman will be landed with that extremely difficult brief and not really be on top of it. So that's an advantage. There are some other really quite good, exciting appointments here as well. I mean, Shabana Mahmood to Justice is very interesting. Hilary Benn, it's really nice to see Hilary Benn back. I have so much time for that guy.
I really like Hilary Benn. Whenever I would have to try and speak to a politician at any point, he was always very, very nice.
He's great, and he did a great job as chair of the Brexit Select Committee during some of the most difficult periods for Parliament ever, almost. And he was really forensic and really good. And so he's gone to Northern Ireland, which is a very good brief for him because, of course, so much of Northern Ireland, not all of it, clearly, I mean, the whole place is in stasis at the moment, which is appalling, but so much of it is to do with the Good Friday Agreement and the ramifications of Brexit for that. So I think he'll be really good there.
Could Starmer be accused a little bit here, though? I mean, with Sunak, to me, it looks like it's a bit of jobs for his mates because he desperately wants friends around him. Is Starmer really just doing a bit of a similar thing? Does this feel totally like it's weighed upon talent, or is a little bit of it not alignment in a kind of cult of personality way behind himself, like we've seen in previous incarnations of the Labour Party, but around an idea and a vision, this kind of Blairy feeling around it?
It consolidates his command of the party, and he can do almost what he wants now with the party. I mean, they are way ahead in the polls. Anybody who suggests that he is failing as a leader is clearly going to be laughed out of the shop. He has a free hand and he has used it. It's clear that he doesn't need, nearly as many people, as you were saying, Zoe, from the soft left as he did, and he can pick the people who he thinks will be really good at the job. And it was interesting today. I mean, the only kind of dissent that we had was from Rosanna Allen Khan, the doctor from Tooting, I think, who was in had the mental health brief, and she was a bit fed up that the mental health specifically brief has been apparently abolished, and it's not going to be much of a post in a new Labour government. But she didn't. She wrote it in a letter, and she was always going to make a bit of a fuss because she doesn't hesitate to speak her mind. Yeah. It's just the way Rosanna Allen Khan is.
As well.
Yeah, but she didn't. It hasn't been a massive thing. And you've seen Lisa Nandy fall in despite her demotion. He really can do pretty much what he wants now, and he has taken advantage of that, and it puts him in a strong position.
Next up, time to choose our hero and villain of the week. Ros, who's been your hero and who's been your villain this week then?
Well, my hero or heroes are UK bees and wasps. And bear with me, because I know Zoe is not the biggest fan of wasps.
It's a really tough sell for wasps, I think.
But there is unfortunately an alien predator moving into the country from, I'm sorry to say, Europe. The Asian hornet, which is
coming over here and stealing our hives.
Well, yeah, it's coming over. It's starting to build nests in various counties in the south of England. And it does terrible things to bees and wasps. There's a terrifying video on the BBC website which shows an Asian hornet literally tearing apart a wasp. And you have to feel some compassion for the wasp because it had no chance. And, in places where the Asian hornet has moved in, it does terrible things to bees, and we need bees and wasps, and yes, so my hero is those bees and wasps. Fight back is what I say against this predator.
So is the Asian hornet the villain, or have you got an extra villain too?
Oh, I've got an extra villain. I'm really down on Michael Gove this week. Really down on Michael Gove. I'm usually down on Michael Gove. Don't like him, but particularly this week. The fact that he abandoned the school rebuilding program in 2010, massively bad judgment. It's a fact that he's that great survivor, Michael Gove. It's like repeatedly people bring him back into the fold and praise what a sensible, pragmatic, clever guy he is, and he has really achieved very little as a politician, as a minister. And I really very much hope that when this government is voted out next year, as we can only hope it will be, that Michael Gove goes away and thinks about what he has done and does not write a book exonerating himself and praising his own record in government, because he has no positive record in government.
You've got to put a pound in the Labour government jar now. Don't jinx it. Zoe, your hero and villain.
Okay, so I really struggled for a hero this week because the news was just terrible. But I think our heroes have to be teachers, because they are being forced to work under appalling conditions, having consistently been stamped on by this government. So there's never enough supplies in schools. Now the buildings are falling down. They had to wrangle with the education secretary for a reasonable pay rise. And you speak to any teacher and they'll tell you they're overworked, exhausted, and really struggling. So my heart is going out to teachers this week, especially with having to deal with the number of concerned parents that they'll be getting on the first day back of term.
Seems to me when you speak to any teacher as well, it's just they're probably thinking about moving abroad.
Oh, yeah.
So many of my mates are just off elsewhere.
Or they quit the scheme. I've had a number of friends who did the Teach First scheme and they quit because they just were driven mad by how appalling the conditions were and how little they were getting paid. So I think we should be making teachers the hero of the week. Okay. That's my plight. And then my villain of the week is Gavin Williamson, because he's just a very unpleasant man. So today, a parliamentary inquiry found that he had indeed, as we all knew, bullied Wendy Morton, the former chief whip, in text. So remember, this was what Gavin Williamson was forced to resign over. He complained to Wendy Morton that MPs who were not favoured by the then Prime Minister Liz Truss, were being excluded from the ceremony at Westminster Abbey for the Queen's death. In one text, he told Wendy Morton that there is a price for everything and that excluding MPs was very stupid. Also saying, don't forget, I know how this works, so don't piss me about. He was demanding a ticket to the Queen's funeral. I mean, it's just a sort of level of entitlement.
Did Williamson have a tarantula too?
Yes.
Yeah, fuck him.
He has a spreadsheet and a tarantula.
Too weird.
And a ticket to the Queen's funeral.
Yeah, it's terrifying there. Right, I've got to pick. I'm going to go teachers there. And I'm going to go Gove for villain, actually, because I think Williamson is an accepted villain.
He's always a
basically,
villain,
whereas Gove, people seem to treat him like he's a bit of a fun time guy, which he shouldn't get treated like. There are a lot of things that young people want right now, but the Tories aren't interested in that. They're focused on what they need. No, that's not cheaper housing or better jobs, but good old-fashioned discipline from national service, according to ex-magician's assistant, former Splash contestant and once Navy reservist, leader of the House of Commons, Penny Mordaunt. Ros, the headlines all said national service, but strictly speaking, that's just not what this is it? What's she talking about?
No, it's not national service in the sense that we understood it. I mean,
Yeah.
it was brought in 1949, national service for all men, only men, and it lasted 18 months, and you basically had to join one of the forces, one of the three forces, and serve there, unless I think you were a conscientious objector, in which case you could opt out and do something peaceful instead. But most people did the military option. And of course, it was relatively soon after the war. There was a feeling, the strong feeling that that was still hanging over people, and they could understand the reason why you might need a standing force of men ready to fight, or in the event of war. So this is a different thing that they're actually suggesting, though they like to call it national service because for the nostalgia value. It's a voluntary scheme essentially. So you would be enrolled in it is the proposal, but you could opt out, a bit like with pensions at the moment. It's not auto enrolment, but you can say no if you want to. And it would,
like with organs as well.
yeah, exactly.
The organ donation when
Yeah.
you die is nudge
Yeah.
theory too, isn't it?
It's a nudge thing. It would be a mix of military and civic service. So you'll get to choose whether you wanted to do boot camp or whether you wanted to work in a hospital or care home or kids or, environmental projects, that kind of things. And it wouldn't be 18 months. It would probably be about 6.
So the suggestion came largely from the Onward think tank, and its head honcho, Sebastian, better look next time you try to become a Tory MP, Payne, wrote that young people are unhappy, unskilled. That was quite snipey of me, wasn't it? But unhappy, unskilled, and unmoored. Was there a point in what you were saying, though? Do you agree to some extent?
Yeah, I mean, there's an element of truth to it. As a 48-year-old, I hesitate to pronounce on the condition of young people now. It would be quite patronising for me to do so, and it does come across that way. But we do know that mental health problems among young people are widespread, and I see that among, my kids' generation, partly through NHS failures and the collapse of CAMS, the mental health services, partly, I think, the effect of lockdowns, partly the effect of social media that has on some people, partly academic pressures, all these kind of perfect storm of things. And these, of course, are all things that the government could have chosen to prioritise in the past and did not. So, but let's be clear, though, that virtually every generation is seen as problematic by its elders. This is a recurring pattern in politics. So you have to ask, what are the particular problems of this one, and would they be fixed by some form of national service? Now, I'm actually quite in favour, which might surprise some people, of a voluntary scheme like this. I think it definitely has things to recommend it. That said, it won't happen because, let's face it, we live in a country where, as we've just discussed, the ceilings are falling in and we can't do the simplest thing. So the chances of us being able to arrange a national service for 500,000 young people every year are very small, certainly at the moment. But it would be a nice to have.
Yeah, that feels to me the only way to actually frame this would be that you genuinely believe it is a good thing for the young people involved and not a sort of solving the problem of young people
Yeah.
for the rest of society and
Yeah.
making that work. And I don't believe this government, I've never really got I'm 30, I'm not sort of as young as it would be to be on this scheme, but I've never got the feeling that they've cared about me at any point.
And that's a really important point, actually. I think it's really important to give young people something that is not just pass these exams or your future is screwed.
Yeah.
And that's basically what you do at the moment. It's get through school. And there's nothing else on offer unless you are rich enough to, arrange your own gap year or sort that kind of thing out. There's no nudge that says, yeah, this is something we can do. This is, you can go and live in another part of the country for a while. You can do something and we will pay you, which will be really important. It's important that people get paid for this, and it isn't some, completely like no money. We will pay you and we will respect what you do and we will organise it properly. And that would be a good thing.
Yeah, I took a year out after college and I worked at a, let's leave it unnamed, but famously messy, quite cheap, very big clothes retailer for a little while. So guess who that was. But I did that for a year, sort of part-time, just because I purely didn't feel quite ready to go to university at that point. And it would have been quite nice to have maybe done something. I made friends there. I feel like I developed skills from it. But I didn't massively enjoy it at any point, let's say, to be honest. And it would have been quite nice to have had something on the table that would have been more fun or better suited to me and more options there. Zoe, as Ros says, this doesn't really just seem like it's going to happen. But is it remotely viable, or is it just a headline grabber?
So I think The Onward think tank produces quite a lot of these kind of reports, and they're very well researched, and they often do grab a lot of headlines because they sort of represent the centre right. So they tend to get backing from Conservative MPs. And they tend to have really good research behind them. And I think this is actually how I feel about a lot of what Onward produce, is that they actually have identified a lot of problems. Young people are unhappy and they are unskilled and they are unmoored. But it's the solutions they posit tend to be rooted in Conservative ideology. And as we're saying, this isn't a straightforward national service, as many of us know that. That is definitely a attention-grabbing headline. So people think that we're sort of talking about conscription to the military. Actually, it's a bit more nuanced than that. It's volunteering and just basically getting young people to work for their communities, work to get a sense of work and a sense of responsibility. Those things you think are fairly reasonable.
The thing is, I feel like if you framed it in that reasonable way, though, I can see, Penny Mordaunt has got a big headline in the Telegraph from talking about this. But if you'd framed it in that reasonable way you've just described it, and you were a Labour MP who said it, it would be Labour MP comes up with woke scheme to give kids a jolly for a year.
Oh yeah, that taxpayers have to foot the bill for.
Yeah, jollies. Yeah,
absolutely. So I think there is definitely a sense of appealing to those Conservative voters who feel that young people have lost a sense of patriotism and tradition, and respect for their community, respect for their elders. Is this sort of scheme viable? Probably not. They estimate it would cost up to 1.3 billion. We don't even have enough money to stop buildings falling down on our heads, so probably not. They did make an interesting suggestion, which was that they could reform the pensions triple lock, which would channel roughly 2 billion of savings to young people and create this scheme, which actually is quite interesting because the pensions triple lock is one of the most sort of regressive and unfair intergenerational taxes, basically. So, I mean, I do think this report has identified a lot of issues, problems with young people's mental health, young people's connection to the community. But the solutions it posits, the way it presents them, it's not necessarily going to get young people on board. And as you say, there are so many other reasons why young people are struggling. And I think a lot of young people feel like, as you were saying, they haven't been offered much from the government. They haven't been offered much from their community. So why would they feel they need to give back? So I think if you want to make young people feel like they have a stake in society, the first thing you need to do is sort out things like housing, jobs, wage growth, things like that, skills, apprenticeships, etc. Those are all the things that make young people feel inspired and like they want to contribute.
The solution in front of me seems obvious, though, a whole big society thing that you get the older kids to fix the roofs for the young kids and just do it like that. It can be secular. That can save us money. The scheme pays for itself. Kids are looking after each other. They're learning to...
Anyone could fix a roof. So easy. Yeah. The other day, just saw a bit of roof falling off. Thought I'd go up there and fix it.
Yeah, put me in a blue tie and I'll be in the cabinet in a week, I reckon. So, Ros, National Service always seems to kind of get brought up as just a bit of a young people basher, really. It's just in the kind of mill. It seems almost like not quite the same, but adjacent, let's say, to when they talk about capital punishment or whatever. It's like, wasn't it good in the good old days? But how does the public actually feel about the notion of national service?
They quite like it, actually. I mean, according to Onward's research, and I've already got that to go on, but they're broadly supportive of it if it's not compulsory and if it's not just military or not just civic, but if it's a mixture of both, seems to be the kind of the magic level for public support, where you get to choose what kind of thing you do. So yeah, I think most people, as I say, are broadly supportive. And if you look at the breakdown between age groups as well, young people are as well.
On that age situation, I mean, one thing that I find strange about this it's always why don't we get the young people doing something? But it feels like it wasn't too long ago that over 50s were being told to literally get on their bikes and deliver food. Why should a scheme like this just be sectioned off to one demographic? Why is this not something that opened up where we could use this as a way to bring people back into the workforce who've maybe become de-skilled after a bit of time out or whatever it might be? But there's all sorts of reasons why this scheme, if you put it forward in a positive way, could appeal to you no matter what. what your age might be.
Yeah, the over 50s idea that Will Stride was touting so proudly is of course, to get them to back in the workforce and out of early retirement and earning money and paying taxes. So that was a slightly different proposition. But I entirely agree that it would be great to extend volunteering schemes because people do actually love volunteering schemes. The number of people during the COVID during COVID who signed up for the volunteer force and did things like volunteering at vaccination centres and food parcels and all that sort of thing was immense. I mean, you had a huge amount of goodwill, and you also seen that with Homes for Ukraine as well. It's something that people will actually do when they're asked and given a structure and given options, and it's clear and signposted to useful things that they can do. But we should also bear in mind that older people often don't have the options and the freedoms that younger people do. I mean, they may not be able to move around the country. They may have caring commitments that they already have. You know, many elder people, late middle-aged, early elderly, are caring for their spouses or their own parents or still their kids, and that takes up time on top of their day job, or perhaps they're on an NHS waiting list and therefore not in a condition really to volunteer.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that because I mean I've tried a couple of times to do volunteer schemes that I've seen. I mean, I'm not going to pretend I'm some sort of massively civic-minded person, but every so
Mm.
often I'll think, oh, it'd be quite nice to do a bit of volunteering, and then I find it genuinely hard to find stuff that fits
Mm.
around my life
Mm.
schedule and is kind of near where I
Mm.
am. And then when I have found things, it's either schemes have closed or there's waiting lists to be part
Yeah.
of these schemes because so many people, if there's a volunteer scheme that's kind of on a Wednesday between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m., that's like the prime
Mm.
time for a working adult probably to think, yeah, I could probably give that a go as volunteering. That's a bit of dead space in the week.
Mm.
And it's not there. So
Mm.
there definitely should be that infrastructure to allow volunteering to thrive because people seem to think it's just I don't think there is a shortage of people who want to give their time
Mm.
away, but there's a shortage
Yeah.
of opportunity to do so.
And it's really good for your mental health, volunteering. I mean, it really, really helps.
You've spent a lot of time researching World War nostalgia, and this to me, a lot of it kind of feels a bit along that. But do people misremember wartime? The kind of what national service was actually like for the people who did it, and what do the people who did it when when we speak to them about looking back, how did they feel about having done national service?
Well, I mean, most of them don't remember because many of them, sadly, who did national service are now dead.
Mm.
You have to be quite old to have done national service, certainly in the first cohort. I mean, there's an element of that going on. There's sort of the idea of that's very prevalent around ideas about the Blitz and the Second World War. There was a social solidarity, that there was a breaking down of class barriers, all that stuff about the Queen Mother looking out from a bombed bit of Buckingham Palace and saying, "Oh no, I could look the East End in the face," all that kind of thing. The idea that uh, social different social classes were mixing in a way in national service that didn't happen otherwise,
Mm.
and that was good for society. And I think it's almost a nostalgia for less a less unequal society in Britain. I think it comes down to that, the idea that, but of course the problem with that is that if you're actually going to do that, and if it really does have to be compulsory, because if it's going to be a shared experience, you can't
Yeah.
have people opting out. So this is a problem which the authors of the report acknowledge. If you're going to have a generational shared experience, you really have to make sure as many people as possible do it, or it's not a generational shared experience.
It seems to me also it means that any scheme like this has to have a longer tail to it as well, because particularly as younger people to me seem to be being younger for longer because they're not getting that kind of access to capital or buying houses, and they've been sort of infantilized for a much longer period of time. So yeah, this might help you out for 2 years, but then for a lot of people going to university, does that say already going to education? There are scenarios in which people get thrown into where class boundaries to an extent can. Yeah, I'm sure at elite universities, perhaps
Mm.
not. I didn't go to an elite university, so I wouldn't know. But that felt like it broke that down a little bit. But there's a short-termism to this, isn't there, as well? Just a scheme would have to be then backed up with a kind of encouraging people to have a further commitment. Maybe say perhaps you do the scheme and then you become a a senior person overlooking the scheme or something like that.
Maybe. I mean, maybe not. Maybe I'm not sure that you necessarily need to do that. I think it can be quite time limited, and I think 6 months is about the right time. Gives you a chance to kind of get into whatever you're doing and actually feel that you're on top of the job that you're doing, and you might begin to understand it and perhaps enjoy it and make friends and so on. 3 months is really a bit too short, and also a year. You're really then beginning to mess with all kinds of, people's schedules around going to university, and you're going to struggle to fit that around the current, the cohort, and when they go into work, and to make that work with university terms.
Sorry, but I think there is an interesting point there, which is the point of this paper was that young people are feeling unhappy and they're unskilled and they're unmoored. So you give them this opportunity for national service, but then what happens after it? I mean, do those skills then count towards their CV? Do employers hire on the back of those? Do they then have a stake in their society? Will they still feel happy 5 years on? There are still fundamental issues that are affecting young people, and this scheme wouldn't fix those things. People are still going to struggle to buy houses. People are still going to struggle to get a job out of university. People are still going to struggle with a number of things that are facing young people. So again, to go back to my original point, the premise of the research, I agree with it. I'm not sure how a national service or a volunteering or an extension of a volunteering scheme would actually fix any of those problems in the long term. It seems, as you were saying, quite short-termist.
What would your dream plan for the youth look like, though?
More housing. I mean, I think young people just need much more support, and I think they need more civic engagement at school. So I would like to see lessons on citizenship and politics much younger. I would like young people to feel like they have more of a stake in government and community. Things like youth parliament is a really interesting initiative, and I wish it could be rolled out on a larger scale. I mean, I'd never heard of it when I was at school. If I had, I'd probably have desperately wanted to do that. It's exactly the sort of thing that precocious 13-year-old me would have been dying to do. Youth councils, all sorts of these schemes that just aren't very big and don't have very much funding, I think would be really helpful for young people to feel like they have a stake in society and to feel more engaged with their civicness, their citizenship. But yeah, I mean, more generally, we need much better mental health care in schools. I think one of the things Labour's proposing is to have mental health champions in schools. Kids are really struggling with feelings of loneliness, mental health disorders, eating disorders, all that have worsened and been exacerbated since COVID, since social media has been much more prevalent. So I think all those things need much more investment. And of course, the longer term problems like housing that I've alluded to. But yeah, I think just getting children at a younger age more engaged with their communities on a sort of lower level at schools, through lessons, through education, through community services would be a much better option than a sort of national expensive scheme.
Ros, what about you?
Well, I would like a national expensive scheme. I'm not sure, I think if it is $1 billion, it's actually not that much in the big scheme of things, $1 billion. And while I agree it's not a priority at the moment in the state the country is in, I think it would be a nice to have. I think it would be really good to have, a few weeks residential, 2 or 3 weeks, and then the chance to either help out in your community if you wanted to stay there, or the chance just to go somewhere else. I think going somewhere else in the country, in the UK, is a really good thing, getting you out of your comfort zone, because this is part of it really, and going to a new place and new challenges, new experience. And none of this is going to be at all easy, because if we look back to national service, you did national service, you suffered it, and there was no way you had a smartphone to tell people just how much you were suffering it, and when people were shouting at you and probably abusing you and all the rest of it. There are going to be times when a scheme like this would come under massive threat from potentially bad organisation and people being exploited, and especially if you have a situation where, for example, farmers are using young people as a source of cheap labour rather than adults to do backbreaking picking vegetables and all that sort of stuff. Not there's anything wrong with picking vegetables for 2 or 3 weeks, but I wouldn't want to spend 6 months doing it. That's not going to teach you very much, and there is a risk that it would fall into that pattern. But I think getting, as I say, people away from what they know and into something new can be really powerful. And, it sounds very kind of motherhood and apple pie, but my kids are both in Scouts in various levels, and the Scouts has been amazing for them. It's just been, especially over the last few years, what they've been through. The ability, what they do there, and the things they learn, and the ability, and how much they enjoy it. And the fact you can go away for a week and not be able to use your mobile phone is actually really good.
Yeah.
I know that sounds terribly parenty, and but it actually gets them out of that frame and that mental space and into what is happening around them. And I would love to see a bit more of that going on.
I think at any age, just being able to have a week of not using your mobile phone is very good. But please, everyone, keep using your mobile phone to listen to this podcast, as I hope you are right now. We've reached the end of the show, so it's time for escape routes. Ros, what's yours?
This is a little bit update because it's already happened, I suppose, but you can still watch it on BBC Catch Up. The World Athletics Championships. My daughter got really into this a couple of weeks ago, and they were held in Budapest. And that's what it says on the tin. It's just a load of athletics. But I found myself strangely hypnotised by the athletics, by the sight of, bloke after bloke after fit bloke, grasping a pole and attempting to vault over a very high barrier. And there were some amazing athletes as well. And also equal space was given to the men and the women, which was also really quite nice to see. So while I'm not normally the kind of person who watches much sport on TV, I got really into it. So if you have got time to watch it on Catch Up, do.
Yeah, I think that the repetitiveness can be quite sort of, it got me a bit transfixed. I was watching long jump and it was on the TV and I thought, I really don't give a shit about this. And then found myself watching it.
There's an amazing Venezuelan long jumper, Yulimar Rojas, who is 192 centimeters tall. She's a woman, by the way. Incredibly tall.
Zoe, what's yours?
So mine is not that cheery, but very much worth listening to. So it's a podcast called The Retrievals.
Don't listen to other podcasts.
It's not. I wouldn't say it's a direct.
It's not a direct.
It's not a competitor.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
It's not a direct competitor. But it's by the people who made Serial, if people know that, it's quite a famous podcast. And it's basically a true story. It's investigative journalism about a number of women who had IVF treatment at a clinic at Yale University. And they had the treatment without pain medication because one of the nurses was stealing fentanyl and replacing it with saline solution. They were in incredible pain and doctors were not listening to them, and eventually it all came to light. But the podcast is brilliant because it uncovers not only the very human case behind the woman, the nurse who was stealing fentanyl, drug addiction in America, opiate addiction, and all the sort of ethical issues that throws up, but also why women's pain is never believed by doctors. And it's just fantastic. I think it's 4 or 5 parts and it's very gripping. You listen to a load of testimonies from the women. And, the university still hasn't really been held accountable for how this nurse managed to steal these drugs. So it's just a fantastic bit of journalism, really. I'd very much recommend it.
Nice. Mine is the Sopranos, which is, I'm really, really, really late to it, but I always just thought there's loads of episodes of this and I just don't care and I'm not going to find the time to watch it. I've started watching it and predictably it's really, really, really good. It's very good.
Still never seen it. I was like that with Our Friends in the North, which I watched for the first time last year.
Well, yeah, that's another one on my list. I've got The Wire is on the list, but maybe that too.
I've never seen any of these classics. I'm just a reality TV person, so I really should get into watching something.
You've got
classic.
to do the diet of something trashy, something classy. So get Sopranos on that. And that's the end of the Tuesday edition of Oh God What Now. Thank you, Ros.
Thank you.
And thank you, Zoe.
Thank you.
Oh God What Now will be back on Friday or Thursday if you're a Patreon backer. Thanks for listening to Oh God What Now. See you next time.